Welcome to Transformers, the podcast about how business people and policymakers are creating a sustainable future. I'm your host, Kai Embren. In today's program, my guest is James O Toole, Professor Emeritus at the University of Southern California's Business School. O Toole research and writings are in the areas of leadership, ethics, corporate culture, and philosophy. He has addressed hundreds of major corporations and professional organizations, and in his extensive public speaking and writing, he has examined how corporations have dealt with social, political, and economic change. O Toole has been Executive Vice President of the Aspen Institute and has been named one of the 100 most influential people in business ethics by the editor of Ethisphere and one of the top 100 thought leaders on leadership by Leadership Excellence magazine. He is an author of 18 books, most recently The Enlightened Capitalists, Cautionary Tales of Business Pioneers who try to do good while doing well. You can read more about the book in the blog page of Transformers podcast. Welcome, James.
Well, it's good to be with you, Kai.
Last time we met, we started to have a chat about is sustainability sustainable? How would you like to define the word sustainability in your work?
Well, first of all, I think you're asking the right question, and it's one that I've been struggling with for over the last decade. And why it's so difficult and also so important, because you can approach the issue of sustainability from a scientific perspective, you can approach it from an economic perspective, and you can also approach it from a political perspective. And they are complexly interrelated, all three, but nonetheless, there are some distinct aspects to them. From a scientific point of view, it's actually the easiest of the three to look at because the data is very clear. The planet is in trouble, and if we don't act, future generations are going to pay a terrible price. Almost everybody who is rational and has thought about this issue agrees with the conclusions of tens of thousands of scientists around the world. So that, for me, that's the simple part of it. The more complex part of it are the economic and the political aspects of it. The economic aspect, which I include in particular the effect on corporations and their responses, that is a mixed picture. There are good signs around the world, but I would like to focus just on the US. There are some companies in this country who are taking the sustainability issue very seriously, and they're trying their best to address it. But at least in this country, they are in the minority, by far in the minority. Almost every corporate executive talks a very good game. That is that they all say the right things, but there is a great disconnect between what they say or what their aspirations are and what they're actually doing in terms of their own practices. That's why I've been mainly focused. Then the third issue, of course, is the political aspect.
With the last years of development globally, corporations today use the word sustainability very often. But do you think has the meaning of sustainability got stronger position in the top corporate management leadership strategies of today?
Well, to the extent that they all talk about it, yes. And to the extent that they are willing to do things that are not costly. The classic example of this is the Walmart Corporation, which has been the largest single private employer in the United States. Amazon might be today, but we can also use Amazon as an example of the same thing. But we'll use Walmart for a minute. Walmart decided that sustainability was a very positive word to use in terms of their public image. and particularly because they had very bad labor relations, and they didn't offer health insurance to their employees. They paid them very low wages, working very bad hours, and few benefits, all of that. So they decided to go on a sustainability campaign, which was very well publicized. And they went into all of their thousands of stores around the US, and they substituted out all the old incandescent bulbs and put in LEDs. And they did all of the easy things that you can do in terms of rerouting their trucks. They switched, where possible, they switched some trucks to electric, but very few. But they routed the trucks in ways that they were more fuel efficient than they had been in the past. And then they advertised all that they had done and that they had invested millions of dollars in this program. And then they pointed out that those millions of dollars that they had invested came cost-free because they saved in their own energy costs over the years. So basically, they were able to get the benefits of the publicity of sustainability without paying a nickel for it. Okay, and so it was the best of both worlds for them. But when it came to any really difficult environmental questions, and the biggest one they have, and one of the biggest ones, has to do with packaging, plastic packaging. And things in Walmart and in those big chain stores are sold in hard plastic shells. And these shells are non-biodegradable. As a matter of fact, they are environmentally damaging from the process of making them, through the process of using them, to the process of trying to get rid of them. They are probably one of the worst offenders in terms of the environment, particularly the ocean environment, but also landfill environment. And but they don't address that question. That could make a really significant change if they change their packaging, their plastic packaging, in which would be very, very expensive to do so. But the benefits would be real. And but they are not interested in looking for solutions to that kind of a problem, because that would cost them a lot of money, and they're not willing to go there yet. And that is unfortunately where most corporations are in the U.S., particularly most large corporations, that they're willing to do the easy things, the things that might make them look good. They'll support a local environmental project, but in terms of actually going back and looking at their processes, sort of all the way back to down the supply chain.
I don't know if you're familiar with the development in IKEA, anything, if you have been studied their way of changing their environmental capital. I was involved in the first step of IKEA's environmental strategy, and Ingvar Kamprad, the owner, he said, "Oh, it's so good combination between environment and save the money."
But well, that's what
that was the driver for him.
Oh yeah, but that's true in the U.S. If you can get that combination, almost any CEO will go for it, and they're looking for it. But often there are trade-offs. There are significant trade-offs. Sometimes there aren't, and that's the so-called low-hanging fruit. Almost all executives want to pick that low-hanging fruit because they get a lot of credit for them. It makes them look good, and it doesn't upset their investors.
Now, what I could see, if I go back and look at IKEA's development since these first steps in their environmental work, it's had this pretty much of a change within the company, and the behavior on the market has changed. Even if they have a huge sources of forest for their products, but they put a lot of effort into education of their employees. And also they have changed the way how they behave in the market.
IKEA is an exception, but I do think that most of the exceptions are not American companies, and I would have a hard time citing an American company that has gone as far as IKEA, and IKEA still has a long ways to go. I mean, they still use a lot of foam they still use, in their packaging, and there's still a lot of plastic in there. But still, I mean, they've gone much, much further than any American company that I can think of.
Well, I will give you one example with an American company, and that's Interface with the late Ray Anderson, who ran the business on carpet manufacturing, and one of the biggest actors in this field. The most progressive American company I have met, who really take on board the environmental issues.
Yeah.
And so you have some good example, but it's
rare. But yeah, by the way, Interface is still, in American terms, is still a small company. Okay,
yes,
it's not.
yes.
It really is not a major company. There are, I can cite other companies the size of Interface, that are doing good things as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that gets back to really your what we talked about a little bit earlier before we came on this broadcast, is the nature of the company, the nature of its ownership, and the size of the company. All of those things affect the decision-making process of executives. And what I am most pessimistic about are large publicly held corporations. That is, the majority of the stock is owned by investors and not by founders or by employees.
In your latest book, The Enlightened Capitalist, you write about the pioneers who try to do well by doing good within the capitalist system. You notify that the commitment to ideals has often left after the founder departed or the family ownership change. Can you tell the listener about your findings in your book?
Starting in 1971, I became interested in companies that were the exception in terms of the ways in which they treated their employees, the way they thought about their customers, the way they thought about their host communities and the environment. And I started collecting as much information about these companies as I could. Over the years, I identified about 100 of them that I could get enough information about to be sure that the information was relatively accurate. There were about 60 of those that I was able to get really good in-depth information on. And then there were about 50 altogether that I really felt confident that I had monitored them in their behaviors and their practices over a long enough period of time to be able to draw some conclusions. So out of that 50 or so companies, over a period of about 30 years, only 4 of those companies managed to maintain their enlightened practices. So shall we, in the terms we're using right now, sustainability was only sustainable in 4 out of 50 of the cases that I looked at. And that to me was absolutely a startling and eye-opening conclusion, because I had been teaching about these companies over 40 years, and I'd given my students, I told them about companies like Interface, and I had them look at case studies and to go visit these companies and learn more about them so that my students could copy them. But after a while, in the last 20 years or so, my students were coming back and they were saying, that's ancient history, Professor O Toole, because we've gone to that company, they're not doing those things anymore. They were doing those things when you first started teaching about the company, but they haven't maintained those practices. And so I started to get a little bit suspicious, and I went back and tried to bring up everything that I learned up to date, which I did starting about 10 years ago. And that's when I came to this very startling conclusion. There were some wonderful things that a lot of these companies did for a brief period of time. What would happen, though, is that the founder would die, or the founder this company would be acquired by another company, or just in the normal succession, by the third succession of leadership, almost all of the good practices had disappeared in the vast majority of the companies that I had been studying. Not just studying, I'd been advocating them and touting them and trying to get my students to do everything that they were doing. So, I mean, it was personally a quite disappointing thing, but much broader and more important, I think there's a lesson here for corporate executives, and that is that if you're doing the right thing, you have to address certain aspects of governance of your own organization if you want those practices to be maintained after you're gone. It can't be personality dependent.
Can you give me any example of company?
Well, positive or negative?
Both of them, yeah.
Well, I'll start with the biggest positive one for many years, which is Johnson & Johnson. And they are a pharmaceutical company and a healthcare products company. They're better known, I think, for their healthcare products than they are perhaps for their pharmaceuticals, although they do have this Johnson & Johnson vaccine, the single-shot vaccine, which it has not been terribly as successful as some of the others, but nonetheless, that is an example of one of their products. They're most famous for baby powder and shampoos and the like. End of World War II, the great grandson of the company issued what he called the corporate credo, which was a list of the company's responsibilities to its employees, to its customers, to the doctors and the nurses they served, and to host communities, and even to the broader society. And it was the first statement of this kind of responsibility in history. And as a matter of fact, Robert Wood Johnson coined the term corporate social responsibility. General Johnson died, and his successors ignored this credo. But a young person who had known him when he was a young manager growing up reintroduced the credo, and by enforcing the credo, they made Johnson & Johnson the model corporation in the United States for corporate social responsibility and ethical behavior. And the case was taught in every business school in the US, because it was proof to many people, including me at the time, that it was possible for a large publicly held corporation to behave in a socially, environmentally sustainable and responsible manner. When that manager who had reintroduced the idea, when he retired, his successor immediately set about to dismantle everything that had been put in place to institutionalize those practices. Since that time, Johnson & Johnson has had a history now over 20 years of repeated ethical, environmental, and regulatory noncompliance. And their history, they've gone from being, shall we say, one of the best to being among the worst and mediocre performer at best. And that pattern was the common pattern that I found in, as I say, probably about 46 of the 50 companies, that I studied. Most of these companies where it's lasted are smaller companies, and they are employee owned, or they're owned by the family. In manufacturing, the Lincoln Electric Company has had about as good a record as you can for heavy manufacturing company over a period of nearly 100 years, and they have been able to sustain that. It has been because the company is largely owned by a family foundation and employee ownership. But even that company now has been selling more and more of its stock on public exchanges, and there are signs that some of their behavior has started to change too. It hasn't completely eroded yet, but there are certainly some tensions there. Probably the best example, and I'm picking industries where you would not expect people to behave in particularly environmentally positive ways over a long period of time. But there was a cast iron company in the South in the US that in the 1880s, 1890s, the founder left the company as a benefit company, and the beneficiaries of the company were his employees and the host community. And that company, in an industry that is notoriously environmentally damaging, one in which occupational safety and health issues are rife, one in which they were in the South in the US, race relations were terrible. They were just these are miserable places to work. But they managed to have this model company. And the secret there is that the members of the board, to be a member of the board of that company, you have to pledge to uphold the constitution of the company as written by the founder. So directors of that company couldn't sell the company. They couldn't sell shares on an open market, and they couldn't use the proceeds for anything other than increasing the well-being of their employees and the host community. And that's all so they're limited to that. And they have stuck with that. In Britain, the John Lewis Partnership has a very similar kind of constitution, but these are relatively rare. But where they do exist, they seem to be the best insurance policy of the continuation of good practices.
John Lewis is a cooperative, what you can call working corp model, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it is technically owned by the employees, but it is actually in effect owned by a trust that is behaving in the benefit of the employees. And it has a very strict constitution about what kind of a say employees have and when employees have a say. And so it is a democracy in a certain extent, but it is definitely a constitutional democracy in terms of that it's not direct employee rule, it's indirect employee rule through committees and elected groups, et cetera, which is what you need when you have a company the size of the John Lewis Partnership.
Yeah, pretty unique model of ownership, and maybe we have to go to Mondragon in Spain to find similar models of business ownership.
Yeah, well, that is a classic cooperative there, and much more so than the John Lewis. It's more democratic in Mondragon, and it has been very successful. What is, I think, fascinating to note is that as successful as Mondragon has been, as successful as the John Lewis Partnership, as successful as this company that I cited in the South in the US making cast iron pipes, is that very few companies have copied them. Very few companies have followed them. And one of the big disappointments of the most enlightened of the capitalists, of all of the 60 people who I looked at, the founders, they all believed that they were developing a model, a corporate model or a business model that other companies could follow, showing other companies it was possible to be socially responsible and profitable at the same time. And they proved it in the short term. Just very sadly, very few companies have modeled themselves after these companies. Harvard Business School put a case study of one of these companies in their curriculum in the early 50s. And every single graduate of the Harvard Business School spent a week on a case about one of these companies. And they discussed it, and this occurred class after class after class for nearly 30 years. This case was in the curriculum. So you can imagine that there were thousands of Harvard MBAs who went out into large corporations who knew about the details of this case. This is Lincoln Electric Company, this example. Yet there's no evidence that any Harvard Business School graduate, any of those MBAs, ever attempted to do what was done at Lincoln Electric and any of the companies that they ever went to work for. Now, I mean, I find that absolutely shocking myself and appalling. But you have to face these facts. I mean, these are the things that we're up against, when we're trying to make change, systemic change in large publicly held corporations.
When I name companies like Ben and Jerry and The Body Shop, what's your reflection on that?
Well, Ben and Jerry's is a fascinating story because Ben and Jerry, and I have a particular fondness for Ben and Jerry's because one of my first MBA students was the president of Ben and Jerry's, and when Ben and Jerry were lovely, principled, marvelous human beings, but they were terrible businessmen. And my student had an MBA from the USC School of Business where I was teaching. When he took over the company, he saved the company early on, and he made the company profitable, and he turned it into a real business. And Chico Lager was his name, and Chico was as much committed to the environmental messages of Ben and Jerry as Ben and Jerry were, but he also understood that that couldn't be done if the company was not profitable, and so he brought the business acumen to the equation. The company went through many ups and downs financially after Chico left. It was ultimately, as you know, acquired by Unilever, and Unilever then attempted to run Ben and Jerry's as in effect a wholly owned subsidiary with all of the practices of Unilever at the time. And Unilever was not at the time of the takeover the company that it became under Pullman. And so Ben and Jerry's was losing all of these marvelous things that it had done. It was only after Pullman came in that he decided that it was very important to give local autonomy to Ben and Jerry's, to allow them to become a benefit corporation, to allow them to go back to the practices that Chico and Ben and Jerry had developed. And really is one of those very rare occurrences of a very large corporation doing something that is right. What is the long-term prospect for Ben and Jerry's? I don't know. There's been a change in leadership there as well. But it did show, first of all, how sincere Pullman was in his goals to change Unilever. But second, how important it is that to have small-scale governance so that these decisions could be made at the local level of Ben and Jerry's, which is a relatively small company, rather than trying to make them have uniform practices with one of the largest global corporations in the world. They would have lost all that was unique and important about them.
You can see maybe some similarity into the Body Shop's ownership model, and also L'Oreal was one of the buyers of the Body Shop. And
yeah, it's the same story. And of course, Ben and Jerry and Anita Roddick all started their companies at the same time, and they were very close. You know, they were learning from each other's experiences, and they were both had some common projects that they worked on, and they both had the experience of being acquired by large corporations who did not share their values. Now, both of them, you know, now of course, the Body Shop now has been resold to a Brazilian company who promises that they're going to restore Anita's practices, and I hope they do. And let's pray that that has a happy ending. But it was nearly all lost under L'Oreal.
Yeah, but this type of company, do you think they have been strengthening the big companies in the issue of sustainability?
Well, you know, Anita Roddick said that she was going to change L'Oreal. Right. Well, she didn't live long enough to test it, but she certainly did not. L'Oreal's practices did not change as a result of owning the Body Shop. And I think in the case of Unilever, it wasn't that Ben and Jerry's changed Unilever. It was that Pullman came in, and Pullman already had the right values, and he just recognized in Ben and Jerry's an example of what he was trying to achieve. So it's very hard for an individual or a unit of a very large publicly traded global corporation to change the values and the practices of the larger organization. There are very, very few examples of that. Most examples, and I can give you countless examples of this, are when people, managers at a local level in a plant or a subsidiary of a big company, that they start doing the right things. what will normally happen is that the word will get out to top management and to the rest of the corporation, and top management will come down on those people, and they will make them adopt the practices, the uniform practices of the rest of the company, and all those good practices will be lost. That's a very sad thing to say. It sounds like a broad generalization that I can't support, but I can tell you stories that will make you very unhappy to hear what to hear what happened.
If you look at the work with the values as sustainability and look at the ownership model, if it has been family owned or been public owned or cooperative owned or B Corp and benefit corps, do the ownership model say something about strong values? Do you see for the future that we need new types of ownership models to strengthen the sustainability issue?
Yeah, I think the benefit corporations a clear sign that there is another way to do business. Unfortunately, to date, most benefit corporations are small companies. There are some large ones that have had discussions with the B Lab to become benefit companies, but nothing yet has happened. The story with founder-owned, family-owned, cooperatively owned, worker-owned companies is entirely different from the generalizations that I have been making about large corporations. I can give you many, many examples of these small companies who are doing the right thing, and some of them have lasted 3 or 4 generations. But what is the characteristic of these companies is that they are small, locally owned. They share a culture. Values are a part of the culture. It's more than just values. There are the aspects of the culture having to do with the institutionalization of practices and the like that allow them to be sustainable. And it is really only when shares are traded on public markets. This is particularly the case in Anglo-American style capitalism, which would be the US, Britain, Ireland, Australia, Canada, and the like, where shareholders have a tremendous amount of power. And in these cases, the pressure on managers who are viewed as hired employees, the pressures on those people to produce profits every quarter, anything that they do that looks to detract from those quarterly profits or marks against those executives, and it puts their own careers at peril. So it's very hard for, in effect, the hired CEO, the hired manager of a company to resist the pressures of investing community. And we see that with Pullman. To go back to Unilever, that Pullman did it. He did it for about a decade, but the pressures from the city, particularly in London, but also the pressures of other stock markets, particularly in the US and in Britain, are so great, that Pullman had to leave. He was probably the model of an enlightened executive, the greatest model that we had of an enlightened executive in a publicly traded corporation.
Yeah, he was the first one in the public-owned company who stopped the quarterly reports.
Oh yeah, he did a lot of good things. And what is interesting is, from a historical point of view, is that he went back to the values of the founder, William Lever, in the 1890s, early 1900, when he became really the first British owner of a large corporation to practice almost all of the things that we're talking about today, including he had a very, very strong environmental streak, and he wanted to have his workers, living in communities where the factories didn't pollute the air. And he was worried about this as early as 1900. And Pullman went back to that. He said, look, he said that this is in our DNA, and we can live these values that were unfortunately lost after Lever Brothers was acquired in the Unilever merger in about 1910. So the Unilever story is a fascinating one because it has gone through so many changes over time, but there's still a strand of the original values and the original aspirations of the founder still has lasted in this company. Now it's like 130, 40 years, something like that, which makes it rather unique for a company its size.
When we look at more into the future and what's coming up, based on the criticism against the capitalist system, and all types of business model have to be renewed to maybe to meet the challenges when we talk about climate change and other sustainability issues. And the word circular economy has been in the front of the discussion. How do you see the way forward for new thoughtful leadership, for new business models?
I devoted my entire life to the belief that the process of change begins with education. And I wasn't the only professor in business schools who felt that way. And we thought that by instilling a different set of values in our business students, and in terms of the consulting that we were doing and the writings that we were doing, that we would have a long-term impact and bring about change from the inside in a non-radical way, in an evolutionary way rather than in a revolutionary way. And I would say that on the whole, we've failed. We've had some successes on the margin. Yes, I think there are some changes. Things have gotten better, but they have so much further to go that it's hard to believe that the changes will occur fast enough, for example, to head off the global warming crisis. I just don't think that if you look at the pace of change in corporations in the U.S. and in Britain, I don't think it's fast enough to keep up, with the problem, with that growing problem. So I'm a bit pessimistic on that score. That's why we have to look, I think, to government regulation. And I think that there are ways in which the capitalist system, the very best aspects of the capitalist system can be maintained and strengthened, while at the same time putting in regulations that will force corporations to act in ways that are good for the environment. Having said that, I'm also will go back to the first thing that we started talking about. We have this test of this before the U.S. Senate right now, and it doesn't look very good. I think some aspects of environmental aspects of that bill will probably be incorporated, but a lot of things having to do with global warming, particularly with the burning of coal and the burning of gas, which are very, very significant contributors to global warming. I don't think those parts are going to be included in this bill. The carbon industry has done a very successful job. I'm not going to say it's a good job, but a successful job in terms of convincing the American public that their livelihoods at stake if we don't increase or maintain the supply of fossil fuels and the use of fossil fuels at the rate we've been doing it. And as long as that perception is in place, the Congress is not going to act. There's not enough pressure on Congress to act. So until there's a big awakening on the part of the American public, I'm not speaking about the rest of the world. I don't know. It's different from country to country. But unless there's a great awakening on the part of the American public about the long-term perils to their children, I don't think that we're going to get any government action here either, or nothing that's going to be significant enough. So, I'm hopeful. I hope that I'm wrong. Okay, and I hope that everything that I've said will be belied within the next 2 weeks, if not sooner. But nonetheless, I'm basing this upon trends that I've been studying, that go back in Britain and the United States now for a couple hundred years. If there are young people, don't be discouraged. Start your own business. You can start your own business. You can do the right thing. That's the hope. The hope is that young people will say, I don't want to work for these big corporations. It's not going to work. What we're going to do is we're going to start a second economy, and that economy is going to be one in which, it'll be for-profit businesses, but they're going to be socially responsible. They're going to be environmentally sustainable, and perhaps we can join the benefit corporation movement, or if not, we can still do the right thing without that. And so what I'm doing now, I say, don't give up. Start your own business. Be a true capitalist. Be an entrepreneur, and be a social entrepreneur. Do the right thing.
Thanks, Jim. And thank you for the talk today. And it was a pleasure to have you as a guest. Thank you, Jim.
Bye.
Bye-bye. I'm Kai Embren. Follow me on Twitter and LinkedIn, where I will be announcing the future guests to this podcast. And you can expect about 2 programs a month. And each guest has a unique story of making business and society sustainable. So find out more. Visit my homepage, kaiembren.org. Thank you for listening.